The crosshairs held steady on a target that every instructor at Fort Benning said could not be hit. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne pressed her cheek against the stock of her rifle and listened to the wind whisper secrets that most shooters would never hear. 1,247 meters downrange, a steel silhouette waited in a narrow gap between two Georgia pines. The target had stood there for 40 years, collecting dust in defeat in equal measure. Behind her, Sergeant First Class Brock Hessler was already writing her failure into his assessment notes. But Elise had learned to shoot from a man who never missed in valleys twice as unforgiving as this one. She had carried his memory across 2 deployments and 8 months of grief to reach this exact moment. And somewhere in the Montana soil where Thomas Thorne now rested, she could feel his presence like a hand steadying her shoulder. The shot would come. But first, she had to survive 3 weeks of hell. 8 months earlier, the hospital room in Missoula had smelled like antiseptic in approaching winter. Thomas Thorne lay in the bed by the window, his frame diminished by the cancer that had carved through him like fire through dry timber. At 68, he still had the hands of a marksman, steady even as the rest of him failed. Elise sat beside him, holding those hands, feeling the calluses that 40 years of trigger discipline had created. "Promise me something," her father said, his voice barely above a whisper. She leaned closer. Outside the window, the Bitterroot Mountains rose against a steel-gray sky. Those mountains had been their classroom, their cathedral, the place where a little girl had learned that patience was not passive, but active, a choice made over and over until it became instinct. "Anything, Dad." Thomas turned his head to look at her. His eyes, still sharp despite everything else failing, held the intensity she remembered from 1,000 shooting lessons. "Finish what I started," he said. "Become the sniper I never could be." Elise felt her throat tighten. Her father had been a legend in Montana hunting circles, a man who could read wind and terrain like others read books. But he had never served, never taken that final step into the military world he had prepared her for since childhood. "I tried," she said quietly, "twice. Iraq put me in medical for 6 months. Afghanistan gave me another 4. The waiver, you have one more chance." Thomas squeezed her hand with surprising strength. Medical Review Board approved it. March 2026, the waiver expires. One final shot. He pulled her closer, his breath shallow. "Make it count, Elise. Show them what Thomas Thorne's daughter can do." 3 weeks later, she stood in spring rain beside his grave and made a promise to stone and earth in memory. Now, standing at the edge of Harmony Church with her duffel, and that promise burning in her chest, Elise watched January sunlight cut through Georgia pines and wondered if 3 weeks would be enough time to keep her word. The bus from Fort Stewart had dropped her at the gates an hour before dawn. 23 other candidates had arrived that morning, materializing from the darkness like ghosts reporting for duty. She was the only one who drew stares. The sergeant at the in-processing desk looked at her paperwork twice before speaking. "Thorne, Elise, Staff Sergeant, 3rd Infantry Division." He read the words like they confused him. "You are here for sniper qualification." It was not quite a question. Elise confirmed that she was. The sergeant stamped her forms without making eye contact and pointed her toward the barracks. His silence said everything his words did not. The barracks hallway smelled like boot polish, an institutional cleaner, and the particular brand of anxiety that came with knowing the next 3 weeks would break most of the men who walked through these doors. Elise found her assigned bunk in a bay with 11 other candidates, all of whom stopped talking when she entered. A specialist with movie star looks and a smirk to match watched her stow gear. She ignored him. A younger soldier, sandy-haired with nervous energy radiating from him like heat, offered a small nod from across the room. She returned it. The first formation came at 0500 the next morning. 24 candidates stood in 4 rows on cracked asphalt while the sun bled red over the tree line. Elise had positioned herself in the second row, invisible by design, But invisibility was not an option she would be permitted. Sergeant First Class Brock Hessler walked the formation like a man inspecting cattle he intended to slaughter. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had settled into permanent disapproval sometime around his second deployment. Gray had begun to thread through his hair at the temples. His eyes, pale blue and cold as January sky, moved across the candidates with a detached assessment of a butcher selecting cuts. He stopped in front of each candidate long enough to make them uncomfortable, asked a question or two, then moved on. When he reached Elise, he stopped for considerably longer. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said, and the way he pronounced her name made it sound like something unpleasant he had discovered on his boot. "3rd Infantry Division." He paused, consulting his clipboard. "2 combat deployments, Iraq, Afghanistan." Another pause. "Highest marksmanship qualification in your battalion." He looked up from the paperwork, his eyes finding hers. "Medical waivers for both previous sniper course attempts. Shrapnel wound, Iraq. Compound fracture, Afghanistan." His smile held no warmth. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant, do you know why you are here?" Elise kept her eyes forward, her voice level. "To complete sniper qualification, Sergeant First Class." "Wrong." He said the word loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are here because someone in a Pentagon office decided that quotas matter more than combat readiness. You are here because your battalion commander wanted to make a political statement. You are here because the Army has decided that standards are negotiable." He stepped back, addressing the entire formation now. "But I want everyone to understand something. Standards are not negotiable in my school. Quotas do not pass my course, and political statements do not survive 3 weeks of training designed to break soldiers twice your size." He turned back to Elise, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I give you 1 week, maybe less." He moved on to the next candidate, leaving Elise standing at attention with her pulse hammering against her ribs and the eyes of 23 men recalculating everything they thought they knew about the next 3 weeks. Around her, she could feel the shift. The specialist with the smirk was grinning openly now. The sandy-haired soldier looked uncomfortable. No one looked surprised. That night, alone in her bunk while the others slept, Elise unfolded the photograph from her wallet. Her father stared back at her from 12 years ago, standing in a Montana meadow with his hunting rifle cradled in his arms, and the kind of smile she had spent her whole adult life trying to earn. The Bitterroots rose behind him, snow-capped and eternal. She touched the edge of the photograph with her thumb, feeling the wear from years of carrying it through 2 wars and 1,000 moments of doubt. "I made it here," she whispered to no one. "Now I just have to survive." She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her father's precise handwriting, 3 lines. Elise's promises. 1. Graduate high school, check. 2. Serve honorably, check, mark. 3. Become Army sniper, __. The 3rd line remained unchecked, waiting. Elise closed her eyes and saw her father in that hospital bed, his hand gripping hers, his voice asking for one final gift. She had given him her word. In 3 weeks, she would check that final box, or die trying. The next morning brought the first classroom session, and with it the full weight of what she was facing. Hessler stood at the front of the room, explaining ballistic coefficients and bullet drop, while his eyes kept finding her in the back row. When he asked a question about wind drift calculation at 600 meters, she answered correctly, citing the formula her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand the mathematics behind it. Hessler told her she was wrong and moved on. When she answered a question about mirage reading, he interrupted her halfway through to call on someone else. The specialist, Cody Vance, gave an answer that was technically inferior, but received a nod of approval. The message was clear. Nothing she did would be good enough. Nothing she achieved would be acknowledged. But Elise had learned patience from a man who once waited 19 hours in a frozen blind for a single shot at a bull elk. She had learned silence from a father who spoke more with his hands than his words. And she had learned, in the hardest possible way, that the people who doubted you only had power if you let them inside your head. Sergeant First Class Hessler thought he was going to break her. He had no idea who he was dealing with. The classroom sessions continued for 3 more days, each one following the same pattern. Hessler would teach. Elise would know the answers. Hessler would find ways to dismiss, interrupt, or ignore her. The other candidates watched this dance with varying degrees of interest. Some amused, others uncomfortable, most simply grateful that they were not the ones in the crosshairs. On the 4th morning, something changed. A new instructor entered the classroom before Hessler arrived. He was older, mid-30s, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from having nothing left to prove. His uniform bore the tab and insignia of Special Forces. His eyes moved across the room with the patient assessment of a man who had learned to read people in places where misreading them meant death. "Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb," he said by way of introduction, "I will be assisting with your marksmanship evaluation phase." He did not look at Elise any longer than he looked at anyone else. He did not single her out. He did not make her feel like a problem to be solved. It was such a small thing, being treated like just another candidate, but after 4 days of Hessler, it felt like oxygen after drowning. Webb began reviewing the fundamentals of precision shooting, and his teaching style was nothing like Hessler's. Where Hessler lectured, Webb discussed. Where Hessler dismissed questions, Webb explored them. His voice carried the weight of experience without the edge of judgment. Halfway through the session, he posed a scenario involving a target at 800 meters with a quartering crosswind and asked for input on holdover adjustments. Elise answered before she could stop herself. The words came out clean and precise, a calculation her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. She included variables that most shooters would miss: the effect of temperature on powder burn rate, the way crosswinds at different altitudes created drift patterns that required compensation beyond simple formulas. When she finished, Webb nodded. "That is correct," he said simply. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, and something in his expression suggested he had just filed away an important piece of information. Hessler arrived late to that session. He stood in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching Webb teach with an expression that bordered on territorial. When the class ended, he intercepted Elise at the door. "Showing off for the new instructor," he said quietly, "trying to make friends." She did not respond. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "It will not help you, Staff Sergeant. Webb does not grade the final qualification. I do." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then walked past him without a word. It was a small victory, but in a war of attrition, small victories were the only kind available. That evening, after the final formation and before lights out, Elise found herself alone on the path behind the barracks. The Georgia heat had broken with sunset, leaving the air almost breathable. She was reviewing wind formulas in her head when footsteps approached from behind. "Staff Sergeant Thorne." She turned. Marcus Webb stood a respectful distance away, his posture relaxed, but his attention focused. "Sergeant First Class," she acknowledged. Webb gestured toward the tree line. "Walk with me." They moved away from the barracks, toward a quiet area where conversations could happen without being overheard. Webb was silent for several paces, and Elise recognized the quality of that silence. He was measuring his words, choosing them with the same precision he probably applied to target selection. "Your answer today," he said finally, "the wind drift calculation. You included variables that are not in the standard curriculum." It was not quite a question, but Elise understood what he was asking. "My father taught me," she said. "He spent 40 years hunting in Montana. The mountains there, wind patterns change every 100 meters of elevation. You learn to account for things the textbooks do not cover, or you go home empty." Webb nodded slowly. "Thomas Thorne. It was not a question this time. Elise stopped walking. You knew him? Not personally, but I know the name. Webb turned to face her. Montana's shooting circles talk about him like he was a ghost. Man who could make shots that defied mathematics. They say he taught his daughter everything he knew. He paused, his eyes searching hers. They also say she might be better than he ever was. Elise felt something twist in her chest. Her father had been a legend in those mountains, a man whose name carried weight in hunting lodges and gun shops across 3 states. Being compared to him felt like both an honor and an impossible burden. I am trying to be, she said quietly. Webb was silent for a moment, then he spoke with careful deliberation. I want you to understand something, Staff Sergeant. I cannot protect you from Hessler. Course regulations give him authority over evaluation standards. But what I can do is ensure your performance is documented accurately. He met her eyes. If you are as good as your father's reputation suggests, the documentation will speak for itself. It was not a promise of help. It was something better, a promise of fairness, which in a system rigged against her might be the only advantage she would get. Thank you, Sergeant First Class. Webb shook his head. Do not thank me yet. Hessler is going to come at you harder now. He sees you as a threat to everything he believes about women in combat roles. He started walking back toward the barracks. There is something else you should know, he said over his shoulder. Hessler had a sister, Caroline. She tried for Ranger School back in 2011. Top of her class in basic, exceptional PT scores, everything you would want in a candidate. Webb stopped, turned. She made it through the first 2 phases. Then she broke. Complete psychological collapse. They found her talking to people who were not there, dissociating from reality. Medical discharge, psychiatric hold, the whole nightmare. Elise felt cold understanding settle in her stomach. Hessler thinks I am going to break the same way. No, Webb said. Hessler is terrified you are going to break the same way. That is why he is trying so hard to force you out before it happens. In his mind, he is protecting you from yourself. He walked away, leaving Elise alone with the Georgia night and a new understanding of the man who wanted to destroy her. Hessler was not just a bigot, he was a brother haunted by failure, fighting a war against a ghost. Understanding did not make her forgive him, but it made her more determined than ever to prove him wrong. The announcement came that evening during final formation. Tomorrow, Hessler said, his voice carrying across the assembled candidates, you will face your first live fire assessment. Known distance targets from 100 to 600 meters. Marksmanship fundamentals. The baseline that will determine who moves forward and who goes home early. His eyes found Elise in the formation. I expect some of you will find this assessment challenging, he continued. For some of you, it will be the moment you realize this course is beyond your capabilities. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I look forward to seeing who rises and who falls. That night, Elise cleaned her rifle 3 times. She checked her scope alignment twice, then checked it again. She ran through wind calculations in her head until the numbers blurred together, constants and variables dancing behind her closed eyes. And when she finally lay down in her bunk, she pulled out her father's photograph one more time. He stared back at her from that Montana meadow, forever frozen in a moment of confidence and competence and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had mastered his craft. Tomorrow, she whispered to the image, tomorrow I show them what you taught me. She thought about the valleys he had taken her to as a child, the patient hours spent teaching her to read, wind and grass movement, and mirage shimmer. She thought about the afternoon when she was 15 and made a shot at 900 meters that her father called the finest piece of shooting he had ever witnessed. That was the last hunting trip they took together before she enlisted. Now, 12 years later, she was about to use every lesson he had given her to survive a test designed to break her. Elise turned the photograph over and looked at that third unchecked line. Become Army Sniper, __. Soon, she promised. Soon, Dad. The range at Harmony Church stretched out under a pale morning sky, targets positioned at measured intervals from 100 to 600 meters. 24 candidates lined up at their assigned lanes, rifles checked and rechecked, nerves humming beneath the surface of military discipline. Elise drew lane 17. Hessler positioned himself directly behind her. She settled into her prone position and pressed her cheek against the stock. Through her scope, the 100-meter target appeared crisp and clear, the black silhouette stark against the Georgia clay. Something felt wrong immediately. The reticle was off. Not by much, a fraction of a degree that most shooters would never notice. But Elise had been looking through rifle scopes since she was 9 years old, and her body knew the geometry of a properly zeroed weapon the way a pianist knows the spacing of keys. Someone had adjusted her elevation. Recently. She did not react, did not turn around, did not give Hessler the satisfaction of seeing her discover what he had done. Instead, she performed the calculation in her head. If the scope was off by this much at 100 meters, it would be off exponentially worse at longer distances. She would have to compensate manually for every shot. Hold low when the scope told her to hold center. Trust her instincts over her equipment. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, clear as if he were lying beside her on this range. The rifle is just a tool, Elise. Your body is the weapon. She fired. The round struck center mass. She adjusted based on instinct rather than optics. Fired again. Center mass. 5 rounds, 5 hits. A grouping tight enough to cover with a silver dollar. Behind her, she could feel Hessler's confusion radiating like heat. At 200 meters, she compensated again. The mental mathematics became harder, the margin for error smaller. She fired, adjusted based on impact rather than aim point, fired again. Her grouping spread slightly, but remained well within qualification standards. 300 meters, 400. Each distance required new calculations, new compensations for the sabotage scope. Sweat trickled down her spine, not from the Georgia heat, but from the intense concentration required to shoot this well with corrupted equipment. At 500 meters, her grouping opened up more than she liked. Still qualifying, still passing, but not the exceptional performance she knew she was capable of. 600 meters arrived like a final exam she had not studied for. This was the make or break distance, the shots that separated competent soldiers from potential snipers. Elise settled her breathing and performed one last calculation. The scope was lying to her by almost a full minute of angle at this range. She would have to hold nearly 6 inches low to compensate. She fired. The round struck the target's chest, slightly left of center. A hit, but not perfect. She adjusted based on pure instinct, ignoring the lying reticle completely, and fired again, closer to center. Her final 3 rounds landed within inches of each other, a grouping that would have been remarkable even with properly zeroed equipment. When the scores were tallied, Elise had qualified, not at the top of the class, but solidly in the upper third. Webb announced the results with the same professional neutrality he applied to everything. Hessler stood beside him, his face flickering between disbelief and barely contained fury. After the range was cleared, Elise took her rifle to the armory for inspection. She removed the scope carefully, examined the adjustment turrets, and found exactly what she expected. The elevation dial had been moved 3 clicks from her zero. Someone had accessed her weapon between last night's cleaning and this morning's assessment. She stared at the turret for a long moment, feeling something cold and hard settle in her chest. This was not going to stop. Hessler would keep sabotaging, keep pushing, keep trying to force her out. Fine, if he wanted a war of attrition, she would give him one. Elise replaced the scope, zeroed it properly, and documented the settings with photographs on her personal phone. The next time he tried this, she would be ready. She was locking the rifle in the armory when Webb appeared beside her. "The scope was off," he said quietly. "It was not a question. Elise nodded. Can you prove someone else touched it? No, Sergeant First Class. Then I cannot take official action, Webb paused. But I can tell you this. What you did today, qualifying with equipment that was deliberately sabotaged, that is not something most soldiers could do. He met her eyes. And I can tell you something else. It is going to get worse. Elise nodded. She had expected as much. Webb started to walk away, then stopped. Your father would be proud, Staff Sergeant. The words hit harder than she expected. Elise stood alone in the armory, surrounded by the smell of gun oil and metal, and allowed herself one moment of grief for the man who should have been here to see this. Then she locked it down, squared her shoulders, and walked back into the Georgia heat. 3 weeks to go. 3 weeks to survive Hessler's sabotage, prove her worth, and make the shot that would fulfill her father's final request. The impossible shot. Target 17. Elise had not told anyone yet, but she had made up her mind the moment she heard about it. That target, the one no candidate had ever hit in 40 years of trying, would be hers. Not because she needed to prove anything to Hessler or Webb or the 23 men who were watching her every move, but because somewhere in the Montana soil, Thomas Thorne was watching too, and she had made him a promise. The stalking phase began on a Monday morning, with fog hanging low over the Georgia pines, like smoke from a battlefield that had not yet finished burning. Hessler gathered the candidates at the edge of a training area that stretched for miles into rough terrain, a landscape of ravines and thicket, and open ground designed to expose anyone who did not know how to disappear. This is where soldiers wash out, Hessler announced, his eyes finding Elise in the formation. This is where we separate those who can shoot from those who can hunt. Marksmanship gets you to this point. Fieldcraft determines whether you survive it. He smiled, and the expression held all the warmth of a January wind. Out there, accidents happen. Heat exhaustion, twisted ankles, soldiers who push too hard and break down. He let the words hang in the humid air. I expect we will lose a few of you this week. The exercise was straightforward in concept and brutal in execution. Each candidate would low crawl across 800 meters of varied terrain toward an observation post manned by instructors with high-powered optics. The goal was to reach a final firing position, identify a target, and take a shot without ever being detected. Detection meant failure. Failure meant starting over. 3 failures meant elimination from the course. Elise drew her sector assignment and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Sector 9. She had heard the other candidates talking about Sector 9 in whispered conversations after lights out. The northwest quadrant, the roughest terrain on the range. Rocky ground that would shred elbows and knees. Sparse vegetation that offered minimal concealment. And a final approach across 50 meters of nearly open grass. It was the sector that instructors reserved for candidates they wanted to break. She began her stalk at 0700. The first 200 meters were manageable, a shallow ravine with enough brush to mask her movement. She moved the way her father had taught her, inches at a time, feeling the ground before committing her weight, becoming part of the landscape instead of moving through it. The memory came unbidden. She was 12 years old, lying in a Montana meadow beside her father, while a mule deer buck grazed 100 yards away. He had his hand on her back, steadying her breathing, his voice barely a whisper in her ear. The deer knows you are here, Elise. He can feel you. But if you become the grass, become the earth, become nothing but patience and stillness, he will forget. He will decide you are not a threat. And then you will have your shot. She had lain there for 2 hours without moving, her young muscles cramping, her mind wanting to rush, to act, to do something other than simply exist in perfect stillness. When she finally took the shot, the buck never knew what killed him. That night, her father had told her she was a natural, that she had a gift most hunters spent decades trying to develop. She had not understood then what he meant. She understood now. The middle section of her stalk was harder. The rocky ground bit into her knees and elbows, drawing blood that she ignored. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose until the air itself felt like a weight pressing down on her back. Sweat soaked through her uniform and dried and soaked through again. She passed another candidate who had stopped moving, his face pale with heat exhaustion. She could not help him without compromising her own stalk. She kept moving. By early afternoon, she had reached the final approach, 50 meters of knee-high grass between her and the firing position. The observation post was directly ahead, instructors scanning with binoculars and spotting scopes, searching for any hint of movement, any break in the natural pattern of the vegetation. She could see Hessler among them, his optics sweeping the field with predatory focus. Elise lowered herself until her body was pressed flat against the earth. She could smell the grass, feel individual blades against her face. An ant crawled across her hand. She did not move. She began to flow rather than crawl. Each motion synchronized with the breeze that rippled through the grass, her ghillie suit blending with the vegetation until she was invisible, even to herself. When the wind paused, she paused. When it moved, she moved. Her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the natural world around her. It took her 90 minutes to cross those 50 meters. When she finally reached the firing position, she identified her target through her scope, calculated the distance by terrain reading rather than technology, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. Center mass at 420 meters, her range estimation within 10 meters of actual distance. She had completed the stalk without detection. An hour later, she stood before Hessler while he reviewed her scorecard. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes burned with something uglier. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said slowly, making each word deliberate, "your shot was accurate. Your approach was undetected." He paused, and in that pause, Elise could feel the ambush coming. "However, I observed that during the final 50 meters, your left elbow rose above the grass line on 3 separate occasions. This constitutes detection in a combat environment." The words hit like a physical blow. "I was not flagged by any observer, Sergeant First Class." "I am an observer," Hessler replied, his voice smooth as oil, "and I am flagging you now." He made a note on his clipboard with the careful precision of a man driving nails into a coffin. "This stalk is graded as a failure. You will repeat the exercise tomorrow." Elise stood at attention, her mind racing through regulations and protocols, searching for grounds to challenge the ruling. Her mouth opened to speak, to protest, to fight back against this blatant sabotage. Before she could form words, another voice cut through the tension. "Sergeant First Class Hessler." Marcus Webb approached with his own clipboard in hand, his stride unhurried but purposeful. "I was observing from the secondary post during Staff Sergeant Thorne's approach. At no point did I observe any exposure above the vegetation line." He stopped beside Elise, not quite standing between her and Hessler, but close enough to make his position clear. "I have documented my observations here." Webb held up a form, filled out in precise handwriting. Hessler's expression flickered. "Sergeant First Class Webb, this candidate is assigned to my evaluation section, and course regulations state that any disputed observation call must be resolved by senior instructor review," Webb said. His voice remained level, professional, but there was steel beneath the words. "I am prepared to submit my documentation to the course commander if necessary." The silence stretched between them like razor wire. Elise watched Hessler calculate his options, watched the fury build behind his eyes as he realized he had been outmaneuvered in front of a candidate he was trying to destroy. "Fine," Hessler said finally, the word clipped and sharp. "The stalk is graded as a pass." He turned to Elise, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, meant for her ears alone. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant. You survived today." Webb nodded once to Elise, a gesture of acknowledgement so slight it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, and walked away. Hessler watched him go, then turned back to her. His voice was quiet now, intimate in a way that made her skin crawl. "You think you have won something here," he said. "You think having Webb in your corner changes anything." He leaned closer, and she could smell coffee and something else beneath it, something that might have been desperation or might have been rage. "The field exercise is next. 3 days in the bush. No observers to save you. No regulations to hide behind. Just you and the terrain and every opportunity for something to go wrong." His smile was cold and terrible. "I have seen soldiers like you before, Staff Sergeant. Soldiers who think talent is enough. Soldiers who believe they are special." He shook his head slowly. "The field breaks all of them. Every single one." He walked away, leaving Elise standing alone on the range with the Georgia sun burning down on her shoulders, and the weight of what was coming pressing against her chest like a stone. That evening, she found herself behind the barracks, cleaning her rifle with mechanical precision, while her mind worked through the mathematics of survival. 3 days in Sector 9, 72 hours of Hessler looking for any excuse to fail her, any moment of weakness he could exploit. Footsteps approached across the gravel. "Staff Sergeant," she looked up. A young soldier stood a respectful distance away, sandy-haired and lean, with the nervous energy of someone who had not yet learned to hide what they were feeling. "Private First Class Garrett Caldwell," he said. "We are in the same bay." Elise nodded. She had noticed him. The kid who offered the small nod on her first day, who tried too hard during physical training, who struggled with any exercise that required silence. "Can I help you, Private?" Caldwell shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I saw what happened today, on the range, with Hessler." He paused, then continued in a rush. "I am washing out, Staff Sergeant. Stalking assessment tomorrow and I cannot do it. I cannot be quiet. Where I am from, in the mountains back home, you make noise when you move through the woods. Let the bears know you are coming. Keep the mountain lions aware. Being silent means being prey." He looked at her with something close to desperation. "But here, silent is the only thing that matters, and I do not know how to do it." Elise studied him. Caldwell was maybe 22, with calluses on his hands that suggested hard labor and an accent that placed him somewhere in Appalachia. First-generation military, she guessed. Family of coal miners or loggers. The kind of kid who joined up because it was the only way out of a town where the mines were closing and the future looked like a slow death. "Where are you from, Private?" "Eastern Kentucky, place called Harlan County, coal country." Elise nodded slowly. She understood now. In those mountains, making noise was survival. You announced yourself to the wildlife. You called out to your crew in the mines. Silence meant something had gone wrong. Teaching him to be a sniper meant teaching him to override every instinct that had kept him alive for 22 years. "I cannot help you officially," she said. "If Hessler catches us training together, he will use it against both of us." Caldwell's face fell. "But," Elise continued, "if you happen to be practicing your stalking technique behind the training area after dark, and I happen to be walking past and notice some things you could improve, that would not be official instruction. That would just be one soldier helping another." Hope flickered in Caldwell's eyes. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." "Do not thank me yet. Meet me behind the range office at 2100. Bring your ghillie suit." After Caldwell left, Elise sat alone with her rifle and her thoughts. She knew what she was risking. Hessler was watching for any excuse to accuse her of fraternization, of improper conduct, of anything that would justify removing her from the course. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, clear as morning light on Montana snow. "A true marksman protects, Elise, always. That is the difference between a shooter and a sniper. A shooter takes life. A sniper preserves it. Sometimes that means pulling a trigger. Sometimes it means teaching someone else how to survive." She had made a promise to her father. Part of that promise was becoming the kind of soldier he had raised her to be, even if it meant risking everything. At 2100 hours, she met Caldwell in the darkness behind the range office. For the next 2 hours, she taught him everything she knew about moving through terrain without being seen. How to read vegetation for natural concealment. How to use shadows and angles to disappear even in sparse cover. How to think like prey instead of predator, because the best hunters understood both sides of the equation. Caldwell was a quick study, absorbing information with the desperate focus of someone fighting for survival. By the time full darkness fell, he had repositioned himself 3 times, each location better concealed than the last. They were reviewing his observation angle when the flashlight hit them. Hessler emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given form, his beam sweeping across both of them, lingering on their proximity, on the compromising optics of a male and female soldier alone together in the woods at night. "Well," he said, and the satisfaction in his voice was unmistakable. "What do we have here?" Elise stood immediately, her spine straight, her voice level. "Sergeant First Class, I was providing peer instruction on observation positioning." "Peer instruction?" Hessler repeated the words like they amused him. "At 2200 hours, in a concealed position, with a male candidate." He shook his head slowly, his smile growing. "That is not what this looks like, Staff Sergeant." Caldwell started to speak, but Hessler cut him off with a gesture. "Private First Class Caldwell, you will return to your barracks immediately. We will discuss your performance failures tomorrow." He waited until Caldwell had disappeared into the darkness, then turned back to Elise. "Fraternization," he said, pulling out his notebook. "Against regulations. Grounds for immediate removal from the course." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "I have been looking for something concrete, Staff Sergeant. Something that even Webb cannot explain away. Something documented and undeniable." His pen moved across the page. "I think I just found it." Elise kept her voice steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. "Nothing inappropriate occurred, Sergeant First Class. I was helping a fellow candidate improve his fieldcraft. Army Regulation 350-1 explicitly authorizes peer training between candidates of the same course. AR 350-1 assumes the peer training is appropriate and professional," Hessler countered. 2200 hours. Isolated location. History of contact between you two." He closed the notebook. "I will be submitting this for formal review. In the meantime, you are restricted to barracks outside of scheduled training events." He turned to leave, then paused. "The field exercise begins in 36 hours, Staff Sergeant. I suggest you spend that time thinking about your future, because right now it is entirely in my hands." He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Elise alone with the insects and the silence and the crushing weight of everything she stood to lose. She walked back to the barracks slowly, her mind working through scenarios and outcomes. Hessler would push the fraternization accusation. Webb might defend her again, but regulations were regulations. Even the appearance of impropriety could be enough to end her career, let alone her chance at sniper qualification. 8 months ago, she had made a promise to a dying man. Now that promise was slipping through her fingers like water, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was lying in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, when she heard whispered voices from the hallway. 2 men talking in tones meant to be private. She recognized both voices immediately, Hessler and Cody Vance. Elise knew she should walk away. Eavesdropping on instructors was the kind of thing that could end a career even faster than fraternization accusations. But something in Hessler's tone made her stop. Something raw and wounded that she had never heard from him before. She moved to the window, staying in shadow, and listened. "You do not understand," Hessler was saying. "You think this is about standards, about maintaining the integrity of the program. It is not. It was never about that." Vance's response was too quiet to hear clearly. "My sister wanted to be a ranger," Hessler continued, his voice thick with something that sounded almost like grief. 15 years ago, Caroline, she was strong, fast, smart, top of her class at basic. Everyone said she had what it took. He paused, and Elise heard him take a breath that shook slightly. She made it through the first phase, then the second. Everyone was watching her. The whole family, the whole army, it felt like. Our father told her she was going to make history, first female ranger in 3 generations of Hesslers. The silence stretched. And then she broke, Hessler said quietly. Week 5, just collapsed, could not take another step. They found her in her rack at 0300, talking to people who were not there. Complete psychological break. Dissociation, the doctors called it. When Vance spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, quieter, almost gentle. What happened to her? Medical discharge. 6 months in a VA psychiatric ward. Hessler's voice had gone flat, emotionless in the way that people sound when they are talking about pain, too deep for inflection. When she got out, she was not the same person. Lives in a group home now in Alabama. Cannot hold a job. Cannot maintain relationships. Our father will not speak her name. Another pause, longer this time. He says she embarrassed the family, embarrassed him. Elise heard footsteps, pacing. Every time I see a woman walk through those gates thinking she can do what men do, I see Caroline, Hessler said. I see what this place did to her, what the pressure did, what the expectations did. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I am not trying to be cruel, Vance. I am trying to prevent it from happening again. I am trying to save them from themselves. Vance said something Elise could not quite hear. Then Hessler responded, his voice returning to its familiar hardness. Thorne is different. I know that. I can see she has something most soldiers never develop. But that is exactly what makes her dangerous. The more talented they are, the harder they push. The harder they push, the worse the break when it comes. He paused. I am going to give her every opportunity to quit, every chance to walk away before this place destroys her. If she is smart, she will take it. Elise stepped away from the window, her heart pounding. Hessler was not simply a bigot. He was a broken man fighting a battle against a ghost, trying to prevent a tragedy that had already happened from happening again. His cruelty toward her was not really about her at all. It was about Caroline, about guilt, about 15 years of watching his sister exist in a psychiatric twilight and knowing he had not been able to save her. Understanding did not make her forgive him. It did not excuse the sabotage, the false accusations, the systematic campaign to force her out. But it explained the depth of his hatred in a way that simple prejudice never could. And it made her more determined than ever to prove him wrong, not just for herself, not just for her father, but for Caroline Hessler, who had broken under pressure that Elise was going to survive. The announcement came the next morning during formation. The field exercise begins at 0500 tomorrow, Hessler read from his clipboard. 72 hours in your assigned sectors, stalking assessments, observation exercises, unknown distance engagements. Scoring will be based on stealth, accuracy, and mission completion. His eyes found Elise. Anything below 70% means failure. He paused, letting the words sink in. Staff Sergeant Thorne, you have been assigned Sector 9. A murmur ran through the assembled candidates. Everyone knew about Sector 9, the sector where no one scored above 85%, the sector that Hessler used to break candidates he wanted gone. Caldwell caught her eye from across the formation. His expression was tight with concern. Elise kept her face neutral, her spine straight. She had expected nothing less. That night, after the barracks had gone quiet, she sat on her bunk and studied the topographical map she had borrowed from the range office. Sector 9 spread across the paper in contour lines and elevation markers, a landscape of punishment rendered in cartographic detail. Rocky ridges, dense thicket, observation posts positioned to maximize difficulty. 72 hours in terrain designed to destroy her. But Elise had grown up in mountains that made Georgia look gentle. Her father had taught her to navigate by stars when compasses failed, to find water where maps showed none, to survive in conditions that would kill most soldiers before their second day. Hessler thought Sector 9 would break her. He had no idea what she was capable of. She pulled out her father's photograph and held it to the dim light. Thomas Thorne stared back at her, forever captured in that Montana meadow with his rifle and his smile and his absolute confidence in the daughter he had raised. 3 more days, she whispered to the image. 3 days and then qualification. And then I make the shot that no one has ever made. She turned the photograph over, looked at that third unchecked line. Become Army Sniper, __. Almost there, Dad, she said. Almost there. The field exercise began before dawn, with candidates dispersing into their assigned sectors like ghosts fading into morning mist. Elise shouldered her pack and stepped into Sector 9 with nothing but her rifle, her training, and her father's memory to guide her. Behind her, Hessler watched from the command post, his eyes tracking her movement until she disappeared into the Georgia wilderness. He had given her his worst terrain, his hardest challenges, his most brutal test. Now he would see if Thomas Thorne's daughter had what it took to survive. 72 hours in Sector 9 nearly killed her. The terrain was worse than the maps suggested, worse than the whispered warnings from candidates who had attempted it in previous classes. Rocky slopes that turned her knees and elbows into raw meat. Thickets so dense she had to low crawl for hundreds of meters at a time, her pack catching on branches, thorns finding every gap in her uniform. Observation posts positioned on every high point, manned by instructors who seemed to know exactly where she would be before she got there. But Elise did not break. The first day was about endurance. Miles of terrain covered under a sun that turned the Georgia woods into a furnace. She moved through it like water through stone, finding paths of least resistance, conserving energy where others would waste it fighting the landscape. Sweat soaked through her uniform and dried and soaked through again. Insects found every exposed inch of skin. The pack straps dug into her shoulders until the pain became background noise. Just another sensation to be acknowledged and dismissed. By afternoon of day 1, she had reached her first objective. An unknown distance target nestled in a clearing 400 meters below her position on a ridge. No rangefinder, no spotter, just her eyes and her instincts, and the lessons burned into her memory. She read the terrain the way her father had taught her. The size of the target relative to familiar objects, the way vegetation changed with distance, the subtle haze of atmosphere between her and the objective. She estimated 420 meters. She adjusted for the downward angle, calculated the mild crosswind from the movement of leaves at different distances, and took her shot. The round struck 2 inches left of center. A hit, not perfect, but enough. She marked her position on her map and moved on. The second day brought observation exercises, hours spent motionless in concealed positions, documenting activity at a simulated enemy camp, while instructors actively searched for her location. The stillness was its own kind of torture. Muscles cramped, joints locked. The mind wandered to dark places when the body could not move. Elise let herself drift into the meditative state her father had called the quiet place, a space between thought and action where awareness expanded to encompass everything and nothing demanded attention. She watched the camp. She documented movements. She remained invisible. On the morning of day 3, she encountered the tripwire. It was stretched across the trail she had been following, positioned at ankle height where the morning shadows made it nearly invisible. A training device meant to simulate enemy defenses, but also meant to test awareness and reaction, or possibly meant to catch one specific candidate who Hessler wanted to fail. Elise stopped 3 inches before her boot would have struck it. She studied the wire, traced its path to attachment points on trees flanking the trail, and understood immediately what it represented. A test, a trap, a message. She disarmed it carefully, photographed it with her personal phone for documentation, and continued. The final assessment came on day 3, a stalk across Sector 9's infamous ridge approach, 400 meters of exposed rocky terrain leading to a firing position where she would engage an unknown distance target while under observation from multiple posts. It was the approach that had broken every candidate assigned to Sector 9 for the past 3 years. Elise began at 0600 and did not reach the firing position until 1400. 8 hours to cover 400 meters. She moved when shadows moved. She breathed when wind breathed. She became part of the rock and scrub and unforgiving Georgia earth until even she could not tell where the landscape ended and she began. When she finally settled into position, found her target through her scope, and calculated the distance at 680 meters, her hands were steady and her breathing was calm. She took the shot, sent her mass. That evening, when scores were posted, her name sat at the top of the Sector 9 results. 91%. The highest score ever recorded in that sector in the 40-year history of the course. Hessler stood at the scoring board, staring at the numbers like they were written in a language he could not quite comprehend. His hands trembled slightly as he held his clipboard. When Elise approached to review her scores, he turned to face her. 91%, he said quietly, in Sector 9. His voice held no satisfaction, no congratulation, just a kind of hollow disbelief. My father taught me the terrain is not the enemy, Elise said, her voice equally quiet. Fear is. She met his eyes. Your sister was not weak, Sergeant First Class. The system that broke her was broken, but I am not your sister, and you are not going to save me by destroying me. She walked away, leaving him standing alone with his clipboard and his ghosts. Qualification day dawned clear and hot. The remaining candidates assembled at Toddfield Range for the final assessment. Out of 24 who had started 3 weeks ago, 18 remained. 6 had washed out during the stalking phase, broken by terrain or heat or the relentless pressure of evaluation. Elise stood in formation and felt the weight of everything that had brought her here. Her father's death, the promise made beside his grave, the sabotage and accusations in 3 weeks of systematic attempts to force her out. All of it came down to today. Known distance shooting came first. Targets from 200 to 800 meters, the fundamental test of marksmanship that separated competent soldiers from precision shooters. Elise moved through the course with mechanical perfection. Her breathing was controlled. Her trigger press was smooth. Her groupings were tight enough that Webb, reviewing them with a spotting scope, made a note on his evaluation form that would later read simply, exceptional. She finished with a 98% score, second highest of the day, behind only a candidate named Jameson Kowalski, a 31-year-old sergeant with steady hands and a methodical approach to everything he did. Unknown distance came next. Targets at unmarked ranges scattered across varied terrain. This was where instinct mattered more than training, where the ability to read distance by eye separated good shooters from great ones. The first target appeared at what Elise estimated as 340 meters. She called her range, made her adjustments, and fired. Center mass. The second target, 580 meters. She read the terrain, calculated elevation change, and squeezed the trigger. Another hit. By the time she finished the unknown distance course, she had called every range within 10 meters of actual distance. Her shots landed center mass with a consistency that made the other candidates stop and watch. The stalking assessment was last. A final crawl through unfamiliar terrain toward an observation post that would be actively searching for her. Elise disappeared into the vegetation and did not reappear until she was in position, her crosshairs centered on the target, her presence undetected until she announced herself with a perfect shot. When the final scores were tallied and posted, her name sat at the top of the qualification list. Highest overall marks in the class. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne had qualified as an Army sniper. But the day was not finished. Webb gathered the candidates at the far end of Toddfield, where the ground sloped down into a valley that held something most of them had only heard about in whispered conversations. Target 17. The steel silhouette was barely visible through the narrow gap between two Georgia pines, a dark shape shimmering in the heat mirage nearly 3/4 of a mile away. "This is optional," Webb announced, his voice carrying across the assembled group. "No one is required to attempt this shot. It does not affect your qualification score." He paused, and something in his expression suggested he understood the weight of what he was about to say. "But for those who want to try, this is your chance." Cody Vance stepped up first. He had qualified in the middle of the pack, his performance adequate but unremarkable. Now he settled into his firing position with the arrogance of someone who expected to succeed where everyone else had failed. He took his time, adjusted his scope, checked the wind flags positioned along the valley, made a show of his preparation. When he finally fired, the round disappeared into the trees 50 meters left of the target. He fired again, further left. A third shot sailed high and vanished into the hillside beyond the valley. Vance stood up, his jaw tight with frustration. "Wind shifted," he said to no one in particular. "Impossible to predict." He walked away without meeting anyone's eyes, his hands clenched into fists. Jamison Kowalski went next. His approach was more methodical, more patient. He spent several minutes studying the terrain, watching the grass move at different distances, reading the wind flags with the careful attention of someone who understood the variables involved. When he fired, the round struck the hillside just behind the target. Close, closer than most, but not enough. He stood and nodded once, accepting the miss with the quiet dignity of someone who understood his limitations. "Good attempt," Webb said. Kowalski stepped aside, his expression neutral. 3 more candidates tried, 3 more missed. The valley swallowed their rounds like it had swallowed every round fired at Target 17 for the past 40 years. 847 documented attempts, 0 successes. Then Garrett Caldwell stepped up. He had qualified barely, his stalking scores improved enough to push him over the threshold, his marksmanship carrying the rest. Now he looked at that distant target with the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose. He fired. The round fell short, kicking up dirt 20 meters in front of the target. He adjusted, fired again. Closer, but still short. His third round struck the hillside just below the steel. A miss, but respectable. He stood and caught Elise's eye, gave her a small nod. "Your turn," his expression said. The other candidates had either attempted their shots or declined. Only Elise remained. Hessler stepped forward before she could move. He positioned himself where everyone could see him, where his voice would carry across the assembled group. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like a challenge. "The woman who thinks she can do what no man in 40 years has accomplished." He gestured toward the valley. 1,247 meters, variable thermals, shifting crosswinds, a shooting lane barely wider than your shoulders. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No one can make that shot." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Every candidate was watching. Kowalski stood with his arms crossed. Caldwell's face was tight with anticipation. Vance had returned to watch, his expression caught between hope and dread. Webb stood to the side, his face unreadable. And somewhere beyond them all, in the observation post on the ridge, Colonel Patricia Drummond watched through high-powered optics. Elise walked to the firing position and lowered herself to the ground. The prone position felt familiar, comfortable, like coming home after a long journey. She pressed her cheek to the stock and found the target through her scope. The steel silhouette danced in the heat mirage. The wind flags along the valley contradicted each other, pointing in 3 different directions. The gap between the pines looked impossibly narrow from this distance. She ignored all of it. Instead, she watched the grass. At 200 meters, the blades bent slightly left. At 400, they showed a different pattern, a circular motion that suggested thermal lift. At 600, the movement intensified. At 800, it changed again. She built a picture in her mind of how the air was flowing through that valley, layer by layer, current by current. She felt the rhythm of it, the pulse of thermals rising from the creek bed, the pause between gusts when the air held still for just a fraction of a second. Her father's voice whispered in her memory, clear as if he were lying beside her on this range. The rifle is just a tool, Elise. Your body is the weapon. The bullet is just metal. You are the guidance system. The scope shows you one truth. Your instinct shows you another. Trust the one that comes from 40 years of watching wind move through mountain valleys. She made her adjustments. 12 minutes of angle elevation, 4 minutes left for windage, a hold point that contradicted every chart she had ever studied, every formula she had been taught, a hold point that no manual would ever recommend. Behind her, Hessler's voice cut through the silence one more time. "She is going to miss," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "just like everyone else." Elise exhaled slowly. Her finger found the trigger. The world narrowed to a single point of focus. Steel and wind in the space between heartbeats. She squeezed. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The sound of the shot rolled across the valley like thunder, echoing off the ridges and fading into the Georgia pines. The round left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second and began its long journey toward a target that 40 years of shooters had failed to hit. Elise kept her eye pressed to the scope. She watched the bullet trace its arc through the shimmering air, dropping and drifting exactly as she had calculated. 1 second. The round passed the halfway point, still tracking true. 1.5 seconds. It entered the gap between the pines, threading the narrow lane with inches to spare on either side. Then the sound reached her. Clang. Steel on steel. The unmistakable ring of a bullet striking its target. The sound carried back up the valley like a bell, announcing something that had never happened before. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The candidates stood frozen, their minds struggling to process what their ears had just told them. Then Garrett Caldwell let out a whoop that shattered the silence. He pumped his fist in the air and shouted something that was half prayer and half celebration. Jamison Kowalski started clapping, slow at first, then faster. Another candidate joined him. Within seconds, half the group was applauding, their faces split with grins of genuine amazement. Elise rose from her prone position and stood facing the valley. Her hands were steady, her breathing was calm. Inside, something that had been coiled tight for 3 weeks finally began to release. She had done it. The shot that no one could make. The target that had defeated every candidate for 40 years. She had threaded a bullet through an 8-foot gap at nearly 3/4 of a mile and hit steel on the first attempt. Webb approached her with something approaching reverence in his eyes. He extended his hand, and she shook it. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he said quietly, "that was the finest piece of shooting I have witnessed in 20 years of service." He paused, his grip still firm on her hand. "Your father taught you well." Elise nodded, not trusting her voice. She thought of the photograph in her wallet, of the man who had stood in a Montana meadow and shown a little girl how to read the wind, of the lessons that had outlived him by more than a decade and just proven their worth in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The candidates parted to reveal a figure approaching from the observation area. Colonel Patricia Drummond moved with the crisp efficiency of a career officer, her silver eagles glinting in the afternoon sun. She was in her early 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen enough of military life to be surprised by very little. She stopped in front of Elise and studied her for a long moment. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," the colonel said, "I was observing from the command post." She glanced toward the valley where Target 17 still stood, its steel surface now bearing a fresh dent in the center of mass. I understand you just accomplished something that has never been done in the history of this school. Yes, ma'am, Elise replied. Drummond nodded slowly. I reviewed your file before you arrived here. Top marksmanship scores in your battalion, 2 combat deployments, consistently outstanding evaluations. She paused. I also reviewed the reports filed during your time in this course, the allegations, the disputes, the pattern of resistance you encountered from certain instructors. Elise said nothing. There was nothing to say. I want you to know, Drummond continued, that I will be personally reviewing the conduct of this course. But right now, I want to ask you one question. She gestured toward the impossible target. How did you make that shot when no one else could? Elise thought about all the technical explanations she could offer. The wind reading techniques, the thermal calculations, the instincts honed over a lifetime of shooting in difficult terrain. But those were not the real answer. My father always said that impossible just means no one has done it yet, she said quietly. He taught me to shoot in valleys like that one, taught me to read the wind by feel instead of by formula. She looked toward target 17. He died 8 months ago, before I could show him what I learned, before I could prove that his lessons were worth something. She paused, feeling the weight of the promise she had made beside a Montana grave. I have been waiting to prove that his lessons were worth everything. Drummond was silent for a moment, then she nodded. They were worth everything, Staff Sergeant. She turned to Webb. Make sure this shot is properly documented. I want it in the official record. Webb saluted. Yes, ma'am. As Drummond walked away, Elise became aware of another presence. Hessler stood at the edge of the group, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. Rage flickered in his eyes, but beneath it was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. He walked toward her slowly, each step deliberate. The other candidates fell silent, watching. When he reached her, he stopped and stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out his clipboard, the same clipboard he had used to document every alleged failure, every fabricated violation, every attempt to force her out of his school. Target 17, he said, his voice flat and mechanical. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne, first round, center mass. He wrote the words with precise strokes, his hand trembling slightly. When he finished, he tore off the form and handed it to Webb. Then he turned back to Elise. For a moment, she thought he might say something, might acknowledge what she had accomplished, might admit that everything he had believed about her was wrong. Instead, he simply looked at her with eyes that held too many emotions to name. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Caldwell appeared at Elise's side, his face glowing with barely contained joy. You did it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You actually did it. He shook his head in amazement. Staff Sergeant, I have never seen anything like that in my life. Elise watched Hessler's retreating figure, the man who had tried to break her, the man whose sister's failure had twisted him into someone who could not see past his own pain, the man who had just been forced to document in his own handwriting the proof that everything he believed was wrong. It is not over yet, she said quietly. Caldwell frowned. What do you mean? You made the shot. You passed qualification. What else is there? Elise turned to face him. Graduation, she said, and whatever comes after. Because she knew men like Hessler, knew that they did not accept defeat gracefully, knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether her victory here meant anything at all. But for now, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel what she had earned. She was going to be a sniper, and no one would ever be able to take that away from her. That evening, after the celebrations had faded and the other candidates had dispersed, Elise found herself alone at Toddfield Range. She stood at the firing line where she had made the shot that changed everything. The valley stretched out before her, painted gold and orange by the setting sun. Target 17 was barely visible through the gap in the pines, a dark shape against the distant hillside. She pulled her father's photograph from her pocket and held it up to the fading light. I wish you could have seen it, she whispered. "I wish you could have been here." The wind moved through the valley, rustling the grass at different distances, creating patterns she could read as easily as words on a page. Her father had given her that, the ability to see what others could not, to feel what others would never understand. She had come here to prove that his lessons mattered, that his memory deserved to be honored, that the little girl he had taught to shoot in Montana meadows had become something remarkable. She had done all of that, but she had also discovered something else. She was not just her father's legacy, she was her own person, her own soldier, her own kind of warrior. Elise turned the photograph over and looked at that list on the back. Elise's promises. 1. Graduate high school. Check. 2. Serve honorably. Check. 3. Become Army sniper. Underscore. Underscore. She pulled a pen from her pocket and carefully drew a check mark beside the third line. The promise was kept. She tucked the photograph back in her wallet and took one last look at the valley. Tomorrow would bring graduation, official recognition, the sniper qualification badge that marked her as one of the elite. But tonight, she stood alone with the wind and the memory of a shot that 40 years of history said could not be made. She had proven them all wrong. The graduation ceremony began at 1000 hours under a cloudless Georgia sky. 18 candidates stood in formation on the parade ground, their uniforms pressed sharp, their faces carrying the quiet pride of soldiers who had survived something that most would never attempt. Family members and fellow soldiers filled the observation area, cameras ready to capture the moment when ordinary soldiers became something more. Colonel Drummond took her position at the podium and surveyed the formation with the measured gaze of someone who understood exactly what these men and women had endured. "Today," she began, "you join an elite community. The skills you have developed here will make you force multipliers on any battlefield. The discipline you have demonstrated will serve you for the rest of your careers." She paused, her eyes moving across the formation. "But I want to speak about something beyond skills and discipline. I want to speak about what it means to exceed expectations." Her gaze found Elise. "Every generation believes it knows what is possible. We set limits based on what has been done before. We define boundaries based on what we think we understand." She let the words settle. "And then every so often, someone comes along who shows us that our limits were never real, that our boundaries were just lines we drew ourselves." She looked across the assembled candidates. This class produced something remarkable, a moment that will be remembered long after the paperwork is filed and the certificates are framed. A shot that rewrote what this school believes is achievable. She nodded slowly. "That kind of excellence does not just reflect on one soldier. It reflects on all of you. It raises the standard for everyone who comes after." The ceremony proceeded through its formal elements. Names called, certificates presented, handshakes exchanged. Each candidate walked to the front, received their qualification, and returned to formation as a certified Army sniper. When Elise's name was called, something shifted in the atmosphere. The applause was louder, the attention more focused. She walked to the front with her spine straight and her eyes forward, aware that this moment would define how many people saw her for years to come. Hessler stood beside Drummond, holding the certificates. His face was a mask of professional neutrality, but Elise could see the tension beneath it, the tightness around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. He had been ordered to participate in this ceremony, to hand qualification documents to the woman he had spent 3 weeks trying to destroy. "Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne," Drummond announced, "graduating with the highest overall score in the class." She paused. "And the first candidate in the 40-year history of this school to successfully engage Target 17 during qualification." The applause swelled. Drummond handed her the primary certificate, then gestured for Hessler to present the special commendation documenting her historic shot. Hessler stepped forward. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elise saw everything in his gaze. The resentment that would probably never fully fade. The grudging recognition he could no longer deny. And beneath it all, something that looked almost like exhaustion. The weariness of a man who had fought a battle he was never going to win. He handed her the commendation. His fingers brushed hers as the paper changed hands. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "Your father would be proud," he said. "I could not save Caroline, but you saved yourself. And maybe you saved me from making the same mistake again." He stepped back and offered his hand. She shook it. It was not forgiveness. It was not redemption, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that was enough. Elise returned to formation. The ceremony continued. More names, more certificates, more applause. When the final candidate had been recognized, Drummond dismissed the formation and the crowd surged forward to congratulate the graduates. Families embraced their soldiers. Cameras flashed. Voices overlapped in a chaos of celebration. Elise stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold. Kowalski shook hands with what looked like his father. Vance posed for photographs with a woman who might have been his wife. Before she could slip away, Garrett Caldwell appeared in front of her, still grinning like he had won the lottery. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I would not be standing here if it were not for you." He extended his hand, then seemed to think better of it, and pulled her into a brief, awkward hug that somehow felt exactly right. "You taught me more than stalking," he said quietly. "You taught me what it means to be the kind of soldier who lifts others up." He stepped back, his eyes shining. "Harlan County does not produce many snipers, but it produced one today, because of you." Elise felt her throat tighten. She nodded once, not trusting her voice. Caldwell gave her a final salute, informal, heartfelt, and disappeared back into the crowd. A moment later, Webb appeared beside her. "Staff Sergeant," he said. "A word." They walked away from the crowd, toward the tree line where they had spoken weeks ago. "The fraternization investigation," Webb said without preamble. "Colonel Drummond reviewed the evidence and dismissed it this morning. Hessler's report was found to be without merit." Elise felt relief wash over her. "There is something else," Webb continued. "Hessler has been removed from the instructor cadre. He will be reassigned within the month." He met her eyes. "What you accomplished here changed more than just Target 17's record. You changed what people think is possible." He started to walk away, then paused. "Every female soldier who comes through this program after you will have an easier path because of what you proved." Then he was gone, leaving Elise alone with the Georgia pines and the weight of what she had accomplished. She walked to her car as the sun began to set. In her wallet, her father's photograph rested against her new qualification certificate. On the back of that photograph, 3 lines. All of them checked now. All promises kept. Elise drove away from Fort Benning as the last light faded from the sky, leaving behind the range where she had made the impossible shot, the barracks where she had survived 3 weeks of hell, the school that had tried to break her and failed. Somewhere in the Montana soil, Thomas Thorne rested, and somewhere in the wind moving through Georgia valleys, his daughter carried forward the lessons he had given her. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne, United States Army sniper, the woman who made the shot that no one could make. The story was finished, but her journey was just beginning.